Now we're going to use the key requirements to become a state and analyze actual real states and try to investigate, are they a state? And we're going to be doing so under the perspective as if we are the United States. Some countries recognize countries, other countries don't. So we're going to use the case of the United States. And so in the case of the United States, is Taiwan a state? The answer is no. To explain this complicated situation, let's go to the map. So originally in the early 1900s, the early 20th century, Taiwan, or the Nationalist Party that became Taiwan, and Communist Party in China didn't like each other. But they said, you know what, let's get together against our common enemy, Japan. So the two parties cooperated with each other. Then after World War II, of course, they then no longer cooperate, as no longer are they fighting Japan. And so what ended up happening was the Communist Party, which was supported by Mao Zedong, for those in the history class, who know their history well, essentially were more of a rural group, whereas the nationalists a little bit more urban, a little higher educated, a little bit more business elites, let's say. And so what ended up happening was essentially the Communist Party chased or ran the Nationalist Party off the mainland of China to Taiwan, where the Nationalist Party set up the Taiwanese government. Now Taiwan says they are their own country, but China, the Communist Party, what they do is essentially just view Taiwan as a wayward province. Oh, they're just, exist in the United States. Oh, Texas all of a sudden decided to kind of secede. Yeah, well, whatever. They're just kind of gone loopy. They'll be back. And so Taiwan says, no, we are our own individual state. Where this gets complicated, if you want to do business with China, if you want to have foreign relations with China, which a lot of countries do because China is so stinking big and has so much clout in economics, and demographics, what have you. And so if you want to do business with China, you have to recognize China as a state, but you cannot recognize Taiwan. So for that reason, just a few countries actually in the world recognize Taiwan as a state. There's about 23, 24 of them. Most of them smaller Latin American, African, and Asian countries. So essentially, Taiwan is not a state because it's not internationally recognized. In the case of the United States, we do not recognize Taiwan, although we definitely have relationships with Taiwan. We definitely help them out with military, help them out with business, help them out with various things, but we do not officially recognize them as a state. The governing body of the Olympic Games also doesn't recognize Taiwan as an individual state. So instead of Taiwan using the flag that we saw in the previous image, they use this flag here. Further, they can't be called Taiwan. They're called Chinese Taipei. And so the Olympics, recognizing once again, if you want China to compete in your games, if you want China to host your events, then you cannot recognize Taiwan as an independent state. But nonetheless, Taiwan does compete on their own, separate from China, but they compete as Chinese Taipei, using this flag, which is not their flag that you'd find in Taiwan. Further, this was complicated in the 2008 Olympics. And so one of the things that happens in the run-up to the Olympic Games is the Olympic torch, goes all throughout the world. What the Chinese wanted, what the state of China, the Communist Party, what they wanted was the torch to go from a Chinese province to Taiwan, back to another Chinese province. Kind of as if, this torch relay was going to then go to this Chinese province segment of the tour. Whereas the Taiwanese said, no, we want the Olympic torch to go from a sovereign country, for example, South Korea, to Taiwan, to another sovereign country, for example, Indonesia, to showcase, we are our own state, just like all those other states, South Korea, Indonesia, what have you. What ended up happening, the torch didn't even go to Taiwan. Further, there was fear during the Olympic Games, during the opening ceremonies, that when every team comes in there with their flag and everyone follows in wearing the cute little outfits, the fear was for the Chinese, for the mainland Chinese, was that at the last minute, the Taiwanese would switch out this flag and put up the flag from the previous image, and then that would be very symbolic to have the Taiwanese flying during the most, the biggest spectacle in Chinese, global sport history. To have that flag flying would be quite symbolic. Now, how about Hong Kong? Hong Kong, they have their own flag. If you have a lot of electronics from the 80s and 90s, from those 2 decades. You probably have a lot of it that says "Made in Hong Kong," so it's got to be their own country. It is not a country. It is not a state. In fact, it is an interesting situation we don't see too often anymore. From 1842 to 1997, Hong Kong was actually a British territory. Even though it was there on the coast of China, it was still a British territory up until 1997. However, it since has become a Chinese province. Very rarely do you see this, a peaceful transfer of territory, of land, from one state to another state. And so this was switched from the British to the Chinese. There was fireworks, there was a celebration. Very rarely do you see it peacefully today. What is Hong Kong? It's actually an interesting part of China in which they have their own economic system, very much capitalist. They do govern themselves. There's another area, Macau, just on the other side of the river from Hong Kong. And so they are a very interesting part of China in which they can kind of rule themselves. And so what they call a special administrative region there in China. So they have limited rule. They rule over themselves, although they are underneath the broader Chinese state. Now, what about North Korea? They've got a rather interesting leadership. They pretty much have a country in shambles. Very, very, very high poverty, very, very high hunger. People die of starvation all the time. So it's got all these shambles. So is it a state? It can't be. Well, it actually is. It meets all four of the criteria, all four of the requirements. And so although it's a country that is, a mess in which they've got some odd leadership, it is still a state. This here is a little closer to home. This is Quebec. They've got a very, very cool looking flag. Quebec is an area of Canada in which everyone speaks French. They've got somewhat their own legal system, so they've got to be a state. Actually, they're not. Quebec is just a province of Canada, just like Hong Kong, how it's a province of China. They do have limited rule, similar to Hong Kong, where they do rule over themselves, like I said. And I'll talk more about Quebec throughout the rest of this discussion, the rest of this chapter. But one of the things about Quebec is it's an area where occasionally you do see a movement for the people within the country to have an election to actually become their own state. And this happens, about every 10, 15 years. And so it's something you continue to expect to see. Quebec trying to become a state, but at the moment it is not a state, just another province of Canada. Now is Puerto Rico a state? They've got their own island there in the Caribbean, and they've got their flag here. So they've got to be a state. And once again, they're not a state. They're actually what we refer to as a Commonwealth of the United States. So the United States military defends Puerto Rico, so that eliminates it right there from being a state because of not being able to defend itself or protect itself. Further, the U.S. dollar is the currency used here, so they don't have their own economic or currency, and also they are not internationally recognized. So Puerto Rico is not a state. But one of the things that Puerto Rico has had a recent vote in which the people in Puerto Rico have voted whether or not they want to become a state of the United States. So come a more established part in which they would have an actual, senator and representatives from Puerto Rico, represent the Commonwealth, or represent the state of Puerto Rico in the federal government. But that did not happen. And also, it's a little bit more than just saying having a vote can all of a sudden become a state. Of course, the United States and the individual states have to agree to that as well. Now we have the continent of Antarctica, which of course is not a state. But interestingly enough, the continent of Africa has actually been claimed and divided up into individual pie pieces. And so just think of the South Pole as being the point, the center of this pie. And you've got these lines of longitude that have essentially come to one point and have divided up Antarctica into different pie pieces, and this is debated. Some people agree with this, some people don't. Some countries do, some countries don't. But it's mostly developed countries that have research stations here. There's no permanent population here in Antarctica. So there's not people who live here, for good. People who are here are doing research, scientists and what have you. And so the Antarctic is a treasure trove of information about the Earth's history, but it is not a state. Now, how about Bermuda. It's got to be its own state. They got their own shorts, got their own flag, got their own island just off the coast of the United States. It's a great place to visit. It's not a state. It's just another British territory. So it's a British overseas territory. So it's not too far removed from what Hong Kong was back in 1997. So just another territory underneath the British rule. Next up is Greenland, a state. And this one is a little bit more complicated. It's actually underneath the rule of Denmark. So it's what they call part of the Danish realm. And it's a let's say a territory of Denmark. However, in 2009, Denmark gave Greenland essentially the ability to rule themselves, and so they pretty much have sovereignty. So some sovereignty, I should say, not sovereignty, but they are one country that you could say, or one area that next 5-10 years could become a state. There already basically are, but once again, these are kind of formal matters, and eventually, and some say probably by even 2021, Greenland will become its own individual state. What about Iceland? Iceland is a small little island just off the coast of Greenland. Is it a state? And in fact, it is. Unlike Greenland, Iceland has already gained its independence from Denmark, and it did so in 1944. And so back then, it actually became its own individual state. And so what might happen to Greenland here soon has already happened in Iceland as they were no longer part of the Danish realm. Now this one will actually probably trick you. You think that England would be a state, but it actually is not a state. England, just like how Indiana is a part of the United States, England is a part of what they call the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And so although we're speaking English right now, at least I'm speaking English right now to you, it is not a state. So if you live in London, England, your state flag, or your flag of your country, isn't what we just saw. It's actually this one right here, which is the flag of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This can be quite confusing, especially when we think about global sport, for example. When we think about the World Cup, England competes against the United States, probably beats them, competes with Brazil, competes against Poland, competes against all the other countries of the world in the World Cup. However, the soccer team, football, there in the Olympics, you would find the United Kingdom of Great Britain representing this area. So there you see very complex situations where, well, in some cases, England competes at the global level in a certain sport, but in other sports, it's actually the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Now let's go to the map to investigate these key differences. And so actually, which is kind of confusing, Ireland and Great Britain, all they are descriptions of a physical geography in terms of, well, these are just islands. And so the island of Ireland has two different countries that are found there. First off, we have Northern Ireland found at the tip, which is a part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So it's essentially part of the United Kingdom. Where the other majority of the island of Ireland is the Republic of Ireland, the country or the state with the flag that has orange, white, and green on it. So this is often confusing because people think of, well, Great Britain. Well, what is Great Britain? Great Britain actually is just an island. It's comprised of England, which is shaded there in yellow, Scotland, which is shaded there in green, and Wales, which is shaded there in purple. So when we think about, once again, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, it makes sense that it's actually these individual parts that we see here on this map that comprise the one state. Now let's visit the Middle East. Is Israel a state? And Israel is a state, but it is very complex and complicated. Why is it complicated? Because within the state of Israel, you've got two different nations. And so once again, we're going to talk more about nations later, but once again, nations are groupings of culture. And so in Israel, you've got the Israeli Jews, so you have Jewish nation, Jewish culture, but also you have the Palestinian areas, which are overwhelmingly Muslim. And so here in the state of Israel, you have two nations, the Jewish and the Muslims, who share the same state. And so in the Jewish part, we typically think of it as Israel, the flag that we just saw in the previous, but as also in the country or the state of Israel is the Palestinian territories. So is Palestine a state? The United States does not consider Palestine a state. Why? Because They're very much close to the Israel is the United States. Israel and the United States have a very close relationship, and so we recognize Palestine as an area within the state of Israel. However, overwhelmingly several Muslim countries, especially there in the Middle East and in Northern Africa, they do view Palestine as their own independent state. And that makes sense. They encourage more Muslim states to be added. They want Muslims to rule over themselves, not to be ruled over by a different group, a different ethnicity, a different religious group. And so is Palestine a state? It's very complex. And when we think about Israel, it contains two nations in one territory, or one state. Finally, our last tour of the countries. Is South Sudan a state? South Sudan is actually a state. It's one of the newest ones. 2011 became a state. And so it is an area that has actually separated, obviously, from the rest of Sudan, became South Sudan. And one of the things we're going to see in the future, I would argue, South Sudan will further break up into more states. So South Sudan, I'm telling you, will eventually break up. And so when we think about how do new countries get added to the whole entirety list of countries of the world, you're going to see smaller countries continue to break off. Smaller areas. And it's all things I'm going to explain here in the next bit of video and readings, but it's all related to territorial rule of an area. You want to rule over yourselves. If you have a certain cultural group or certain religion, certain language, and you speak that language, you practice that religion in large numbers in a particular area, but you're being ruled by a larger group that is different than you, that has a different religion, you're typically going to want to rule over yourselves. You want to become your independent state. You want to become a sovereign country yourself.